1 Samuel chapter 16. And for your reading this morning, I just want to focus in on the A portion of the text in 1 Samuel chapter 16. The word of God says, "So Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord took control of David from that day forward. So Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord took control of David that day forward." You may be seated. This morning I want to talk around the text, when God promotes. When God promotes. Amen. Good to see my brother, Minister Foreman. Good to see you, man. Good to see you, bro. Good to see you, man. When God promotes. I'm going to give y'all a couple minutes. I know y'all happy to see it. Go ahead. Go ahead. Amen. When God promotes. Out in the western part of the United States is a place called the Synchronicity Desert. Its span covers the southwest part of the Arizona and California area, actually totaling over 260,000 kilometers, with parts straddling near the U.S.-Mexican border. It's interesting because you would think that the U.S. government would have a large level of security presence, but they don't. The security presence is extremely low because the Synchronicity Desert is considered to be one of the most hottest, dangerous deserts in the world. Statistics show that the Synchronicity Desert has temperatures ranging from 70 to 90 degrees during the winter months alone. Certainly, that's not the place to be. You don't want to be there to catch a flat tire. Somewhere in the middle of this dangerous desert, you will find what is called the elephant tree, a plant that is known by its large, massive trunks. Studies have shown that the elephant tree means of survival is the ability to draw from somewhere, some way, somehow, massive amounts of water. In fact, it is known to hold up to 3 days' worth of water right in the midst of rough terrain. And although it is small in stature, some way, somehow, this elephant tree understands the environment it is in and finds a way to survive in the harsh, inclement conditions of the Synchronicity Desert. Other plants are there too. And while the other plants and the wildlife is in the midst of the Synchronicity Desert, eventually it dies off. But some way, somehow, the elephant tree survives. As I begin to read about the elephant tree and study about this plant called the elephant tree, my homiletical antennas begin to go up. Because sadly enough, what I've discovered is some people fail to do exactly what the elephant tree does, and that is survive in harsh conditions. I've discovered that it is the junction of the life of a Christian that some of us find harsh environment areas rough and unbearable. I've discovered that we seem to buckle under the pressure of some particular environments in our lives. Some of us don't even want to talk about the environments that we are in. But one thing that I've discovered is certain. One thing I've learned is this, is that you cannot change your environment. But the one thing you can do is you can change your attitude towards your environment. We love to pack our bags and relocate to another place in another environment and another dimension if we really could. and start all over again. But the truth of the matter is sometimes we really can't. However, what we can do is when we find ourselves in these desert-like experiences, what we can do is we can ask God to show us exactly what it is he's trying to teach us in this present point in our lives. Because I've discovered, I had this sneaky suspicion to believe that despite our personal beliefs and innuendos, God enrolls each and every one of us into the school of hard knocks. And not only for our understanding about him, but he also does it for our own personal development. In other words, our stressful environment instantly becomes our classroom for development. And God is our teacher. And his expectation is that we not love our situation, but he expects for us to face it and learn it. And once we have matriculated from God's lesson plan, God will then allow us to graduate to new undiscovered territory. But it will not happen until you excel in the designated place where you are in right now. Literally, what that is, basically, that's the whole plan, if you will, of God. And an example of this is found of this theological pattern is found right here in today's text. God's chosen prophet, Samuel, is traveling to a place called Bethlehem. He's traveling to Bethlehem because he was commanded by the one who is known as Yahweh. He has just went through a period of mourning for the current ruler of that time, and that is King Saul. Believe it or not, Samuel had a sincere love for King Saul and his family. But unfortunately, Saul, who was considered to be the people's champ, has been rejected by God. On numerous occasions, King Saul was given specific orders, and he failed to listen to the voice of God. And as a result, the Lord has now torn away the kingdom of Israel from King Saul. At the same time, God has already went into preparation mode of developing a replacement for Saul. He knew Saul was not going to last in that position because he was chosen by the people and not by him. Yet God was patient and he allowed the people to choose a king, even though he already knew their perception was misconstrued. So after their choice failed, he elevated the one whom he was preparing. Samuel then reaches Bethlehem and gives a personal invitation to Jesse and his sons to join him in giving a sacrifice to the Lord. Jesse accepts the sacrifice. Accepts the offer, and he goes with Samuel to make a sacrifice unto the Lord with his sons accompanying him. Are y'all here with me? And while presenting their worship to God, God reminds Samuel that he does not look at the outward appearance like man does, but rather he looks at the heart. What that suggests is that the outward presentation in God's eyes is really irrelevant, but internal motivation is really what matters. So after being introduced to the 7 sons of Jesse, Samuel scratches his head in a quite perplexed fashion because none of them seem to fit the qualifications. Are these all your children? Samuel began to ask. And Jesse snaps his finger and remembers, and he says, oh yeah, there's that young lad, but he's out keeping the sheep. Samuel then requests to meet him. And in obedience, when David's eyes meet Samuel, the Lord confirmed that this is the one. Samuel then takes out his horn of oil and anoints David that day as the new upcoming king of Israel. Now, I've read this story numerous times. I've read about the past life of King David. But as I begin to read this time, God seemed to have given me a new notion to this novella. Because as I begin to read the text, I begin to believe that David's blessing came at the time, not at the time of his promotion, but the blessing actually came in the lessons that he learned prior to the promotion. Because as much as we enjoy to witness the promotion, as much as we love to witness the elevation, the outcome is not going to happen. It's only going to happen, and it comes through the arms of learned lessons. I've discovered that the elevation that was given to David in verse 13 is a revelation of something that has been developing way before that, which suggests that David had to experience a period of hard training, separation, and being ridiculed before he can receive his blessing. I really wish y'all was paying attention to me this morning, because the elevation that was received is the apex of the lessons that he had learned before receiving the blessing. Now, this theory is unorthodox to you and I, and it's hard for us to accept this because when we are in our desert-like experiences, many of us tend to preserve our time of celebration for the end, when we got the thing that God was given to us. But what we seem to miss is we miss the opportunity of worshiping him when we are in the midst of our stuff. Talk down, Beale. And as a result, we make our tour of duty much more harder than really what it needs to be. But after I begin to read this text, I begin to understand that God's expectation is direct and simple. And that is, he is looking for us to worship him, not at the end, but while we're going through. Because as much as we don't like being in the field, if we are not careful, we will literally miss the opportunity to flourish, the opportunity to learn, the opportunity to be developed before God even promotes us. Okay, let me see if I can talk to this side, because y'all just not getting it. There are some lessons that you and I must learn that will not only help us, but it's also going to challenge us as we're going to receive our promotions. And so if you don't mind, I know we're in a Baptist church, and so can I give you 3 points? And then I'm going to go ahead and sit down. The first thing you want to look at is the level of David. The level of David. Look at verse number 11. Samuel asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse said, "They're still the youngest, but right now he's tending the sheep." Don't read too fast. You're going to get a speeding ticket. You got to slow down and check this out. Samuel asks, "Are these all the sons that you have?" Jesse said, "They're still the youngest, but right now he's tending the sheep." Samuel said to Jesse, "Send for him, and we're not going to sit down until he gets here." Here's the first question I want to ask you. If you're looking for God to promote you, can you handle being viewed as a nobody before God elevates you to somebody? Let me help y'all out. In the text, Jesse addresses the 7 as his sons, but Jesse got 8 sons. Jesse addresses the sons, but when it came time to talk about David, Jesse describes him as the youngest and the keeper of the sheep. Interesting, doesn't even have a name. He's just given a title. A title that describes who he is in numerical order and who he is in status. The text doesn't tell us, but I wonder how long did David really had to deal with being addressed this way? Not as his son, but as the youngest. Not as his boy, but as his employee. And it is obvious this is the relationship he has with David because he wasn't even invited to the worship. Before God can elevate some of us, we sometimes have to accept this type of status from some people. As a matter of fact, they may don't want to, but you must be willing to live with the fact that some people may not accept who you really are and try to decrease you to who they want you to be. Oh, I just said something right there. Our job is not to accept who people say we are. We got to accept not what the people says, but we got to accept who God say we are. Because even though Jesse classified him as being the young one and the keeper of the sheep, God overlooked everything that man said at that particular moment and defined him as being the chosen one. Am I helping y'all this morning? See, this is why, can I park here for a moment? This is why you and I have to be careful of the names and the titles that you speak over your sons and daughters. Because the names and the titles that you speak over your sons and daughters are important for the betterment of their future. Because you got to understand this. In 2016, society already has a name and a title already picked out for them. If you don't begin to instill in them an encouragement, a name that is going to bless their lives, they will literally take your spot and give them the title that they already had for your son and daughter. And it is your responsibility to give them the name that is going to encourage them. Don't be like Jesse, who has a blessing right before his eyes, but minimizes him to the keeper. You would think that if there's anyone who would call David blessed, or if there's anyone that will call David his right name, it will be Jesse. I mean, after all, Jesse came from a lineage of successful men. Jesse is the son of Obed and the grandson of Boaz. And I know I'm in Bible country, so y'all know exactly who they are. His grandfather was a successful landowner. His daddy was a successful worshiper. And we know but by the text that Jesse too is successful because Jesse made his son an employee over his many sheep. But instead of instilling in him the values of encouragement, David had to spend time separated from others because he was considered the young one and the keeper of the sheep. And the eyes of Jesse was too immature. And in the eyes of Jesse, he was too immature and he was too small to fit into the qualifications that he already had in his mind. Some of us fit into the same position like David, only known as the young one, only known as the immature one. Don't have any knowledge at all. Don't have any expertise. You're just a keeper of sheep. And it's amazing because society has placed a certain standard out there for each and every one of us. And if we don't meet that standard as society says, then you're considered an average Joe. You consider a low class. The society says you have to make a certain amount of income. You have to go to college this long. You have to get more degrees than a thermometer. You have to be living with this white picket fence. Got to have a wife or a husband, 2 kids, and a dog. That's what society says. And if you're not meeting those standards, if you're not meeting those standards according to society, then you're just nothing but merely a keeper of sheep. If there's anyone who agrees with the furthering of education, it is me. However, what I've discovered, that even though I can get all the education I want, what this text is showing me is, even if I don't obtain the degrees, even if I don't obtain those standards according to what society says, God still can elevate me into who he wants me to be. Because God says, I don't look at the outside appearance. I look at the inward heart. Come here, Paul. Paul said this. Paul said, but God chose the foolish things of this world to be conformed to the wise. And that word foolish is the Greek word moro, which where we get the word moron. So what that is telling me is every once in a while, God has to look out and find a moron and choose the moron and elevate the moron to where he wants him to be. I believe there are some morons in the house. Because every once in a while, God has to skip over the one with the degrees and say, you're doing well, I love you, but let me get the moron. And I have a way of taking the moron and elevating to who I want him to be. So you got to look at this. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get excited. I'm sorry. So you got to look at this. Look at the level of David. Not only look at the level of David, but look at the location of David. Verse 12. Jesse sent for him. It says he had beautiful eyes and a healthy and handsome appearance. The Lord said, anoint him, for he is the one. He says, Jesse sent for him. Now remember, they was all out to worship. But Jesse had to go back, go a different direction, and send for David. And so here's my question for you. If y'all want to tweet something, if this is Twittable, if that's a word, y'all know what I'm saying. Can you handle going through seasons of separation before going through a period of promotion? Can you handle going through seasons of separation before going through a period of promotion? Because what the text shows us is this. The text shows us is before David comes in contact with Samuel and is anointed, David was summoned away from everyone else. Before he was given his promotion, David had to go through a period of exclusion instead of inclusion. David had to accept the fact that he would not be invited into every circle or every event. Instead of being invited to every block party, to every cabaret, to every turn-up party, David had to accept that his time and duty at this particular point in his life was he had to accept that he had to be alone. And he had to accept that he was not allowed to be in the presence of everybody. David had to accept the fact that he had to remain in solitude. Now, already I lost some of y'all because some of us find this extremely hard to accept because some of us believe our DNA makeup suggests that I always have to be around individuals. Some of us believe I always got to be in the in crowd. I always got to be the life of the party. The party doesn't start until I get there. And because some of us are extroverts, we feel like God is punishing us when he makes us be alone. But what God is doing is God is separating you and I just so he can groom us. Here's where we mess up. We mess up because we look at the time was separated. Notice the text never tells us how long David was out in a location. We just know that he was out there for a period of time. And he was out there for a period of time before he was being elevated. And so he was out there for a period of time, for a long period of time, before he got anywhere else. Our frustration comes when we begin to stare at our time of loneliness as an indictment instead of a privilege and an opportunity. Just because David was in the field doesn't mean he had the right to look at the longevity of the time alone. Because looking at longevity promotes discouragement. David got it right. David looked at this at the time in the field as an opportunity to give God worship. And when he began to focus on his worship rather than his work, I believe he didn't mind being in the field. Because sometimes what I begin to understand, sometimes it's good to be out in a field with a bunch of animals instead of being around some people who really don't even care about me. I think I just lost some of y'all. As a matter of fact, some of David's best worship happened when he was in the field, away from the haters, away from the gossip, away from the backstabbers. And so the question is, can you praise God in your right now instead of waiting for your not yet? Because before you receive the blessings God has for you, you need to embrace the fact that God has you in the place where you are right now, at this right time, at this particular place, ultimately not for your punishment, but for your worship. So you got to look at this. There is the location. There's the level of David. Finally, there is the elevation of David. Verse 12. Jesse sent for him. He had beautiful eyes and a healthy, handsome appearance. Then the Lord said, anoint him because he's the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord took control of David from that day forward. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. David spent some time in the field, and it was time for him to be promoted to the next level. The text says someone came for him to anoint him. Now, my Bible, and I believe your Bibles, doesn't literally tell us who the someone is. But what we do know is that we believe that this is someone who was not out in the field with David, but this someone was in the circle in the house. Y'all missed it. Whoever this someone is, the someone didn't care about David. The someone allowed David to be out in the valley alone because he thought there was more excitement in the house. Now, here's what's amazing about the someone. We don't know who the someone is, but the one thing we do know is the someone was chosen to be where he was at that particular point of time. Are y'all with me? At that particular point of time. And he was used for the purpose of going to get David and literally bringing David to his elevation. Y'all gonna get this in a minute. He doesn't have a name, doesn't have an identity, don't know where he came from, What we do know is the someone is really special. Because the someone was in the right place at the right time to go and be the transporter for David, to get David from where he was, to get him in the house in order to be anointed. I'm going to help y'all. There is a school of thought called Synchronicity. It's a school of thought that is talked about in the realm of psychology. A school of thought that is given by a person by the name of Carl Jung. Carl Jung says this. Carl says, there is out there the ability of various things, various situations, to some way, somehow all come together for a particular purpose. I'm going to help y'all. So what I'm trying to get you to see is, we don't know where the someone came from, but God made sure he synchronized time to make sure that wherever the someone came from, the someone had to be right there at that right place at that right time in order to get David into his promotion. Doesn't matter where he came from. Doesn't matter what his position was. God made sure that wherever he was in his life, everything linked up to get him to the place to be the one who was summoned to get David to his elevation. The only reason why this someone was there in the first place, because he was being used as the elevation, being used as the transporter to get God to get David to where he was at. When you really think about it, when God is trying to promote some of us, sometimes God will allow certain people to be in our life only at that particular point in time in order to be able to connect us, to get us to where it is he's trying to get us. I figure y'all get it. Some of y'all, I'm gonna help you out. Let's make it more practical. Some of y'all was trying to get promotions on your job. You don't put in application upon application upon application upon application, but all of a sudden, this person from human resource all of a sudden gets your resume. You've never heard of this person. You don't talk to the CEO. You don't talk to the VP. You don't talk to this person. You don't talk to that person. But this person mysteriously shows up and they take your resume. And you ain't got the qualifications. Remember, you're a moron. But some way, somehow, that particular person is in that job at that particular time in order to get you to your elevation. Do y'all know what I'm talking about now? I figure y'all would get it. And so here it is. And so this is what happens in this text. The someone shows up, goes out to get David and gets him to his elevation. Now here's the part I really like. The someone had common sense to go out and get David in order to get him promoted. But here it is, his own brothers didn't even have the decency to go out to get him. And God is such a blessing because God put them in a position where they had to stand at allegiance when David was getting anointed for his elevation. See, this is why you got to be careful about who you talk about. Because don't you realize that sometimes your haters will now become your elevators, and them same people that talked about you like a dog, all of a sudden God will make a way for them to be in the presence. I love this text. Because here it is. They was in the house. Brown nosing. I'm sorry, can I say this? Kissing up. When here it is, the one who really mattered was out there with a bunch of animals. And let me help you with this. And I'm done. I promise I'm done. I told you by 7:59 you'll be out of here. Here's where the blessing is. If you want God to promote you, sometimes you have to be willing to take care of other people's stuff before he elevates you in order to deal with somebody else. Because he was out there dealing with sheep that wasn't even his. Yet because of the heart that he had, David still accepted the sheep as his home. Didn't complain, didn't murmur, said this is not my job description. Hello, somebody. Say I wasn't supposed to be chosen for this. This is not the training that I took. I just went on and shut up and did the job. He didn't worry about what Jesse was thinking. He did everything in the eyes of God. And the only time he opened his mouth was to give God worship. And so because of his heart, God says, I'm choosing him. I'm going to promote him. No, not you, him. Because God looked at the inward appearance. I thank God for David. I thank God for David's anointing. I thank God for what David has taught us about being sustained in the desert. I thank God about David teaching us about levels, about our attitude in certain locations. I thank God that David wasn't the only one who was used, who was elevated in front of his haters. It's interesting how God will literally give us signs that will always point us to something greater. Because Samuel witnessed the elevation of David in Bethlehem. But there was another elevation that occurred in Bethlehem. David was summoned to work for the Father. But there was another who was summoned to work for the Father. David was overlooked by people in his family. But there was another one who was overlooked by most of mankind. David was chosen to tend his father's sheep. But there was another one who was called the Good Shepherd. David was elevated to become the king of Israel. But there is another one who was called the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He was called Wonderful, Counselor, Almighty God, Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. And he too was lied on, cheated, talked about, mistreated, used, and scorned. Y'all know the song, talked about, as sure as you're born. But his elevation happened not in a home, but in a place called Calvary. Here, in a place called Calvary, where they talked about him all night long. And at that particular moment, he understood that he was chosen for elevation. And so he got himself together, went down the Via Dolorosa, up to a place called the Skull, stretched out his arms, allowed nails to be put in his hands, allowed nails to be put in his feet. They hung him high. They stretched him wide. They hung him high. And they dropped him low. They hung him high, stretched him wide. He hung his head. For you and me, he died. Y'all know the story. They put him in a borrowed tomb. He laid there all day Friday, all day Saturday. Come on, raise your head back. and say, but early Sunday morning, he got up with all power in his hand. And because he can be elevated, I can be elevated. You can be elevated. Yeah!